there are lots of things going on in the world right now. But one of the things that I have been paying attention a lot to lately is basically how our government is and how our economic system is failing slowly but surely over a period of time. So I wanted to take a look at this video with you guys here. And this is a second thought video. And it is about how American workers are losing billions. And what our labor's worth. That sort of thing. So, just real quickly, let's go over this. Yeah, this video is really interesting. It explains a lot about how late stage capitalism is working, so on and so forth. So let's take a look.
This episode and others like it are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help support this channel and get early access to every video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. I also recently started a podcast with Hakeem and Ugopnik. You can check it out by following the link below.
Dun-dun-dun.
Put every robbery together and you end up with an impressive
that you follow this guy, subscribe to his videos. He's pretty awesome.
Number, $482 million. That's the massive amount that was stolen in just under 270,000 robberies in 2019. A total that includes house robberies, bank robberies, and even old-timey cowboy holdups.
Old-timey cowboy holdups? All right. There's not enough of those anymore.
If you add to that number burglaries, larceny, and motor vehicle theft, you get around $13 billion of value stolen over just 12 months. But as dramatic as that number is, it pales in comparison to just how much is stolen from American workers every single year. In this episode, we're going to be looking at wage theft, corporate and white-collar crime, and the criminogenic nature of capitalism. In other words, the ways in which capitalism actually produces crime and even goes so far as to justify it. I won't...
Yeah, the fact that our elections are bought and paid for, like, our politicians are bought and paid for, all of that stuff. It's basically legalized bribery.
Lie to you that, as a Marxist, I believe that the central feature of capitalism, wage labor, is itself a form of theft. But that's not going to be the focus of this video because, if we're being honest, you probably wouldn't sit through a 15-minute video essay on the labor theory of value. Instead,
I mean, I would, but you guys probably wouldn't.
Going full shock value this episode and looking strictly at the billions of dollars stolen within the rules laid out by capitalism. So, let's start with wage theft. You may have heard about it recently with the Walmart settlements, but it's not a very common term, so let me explain a bit. Very simply, wage theft is when you don't get paid even though you're supposed to. Whether it's because you worked overtime but it wasn't counted, had your tips withheld or not compensated for on a slow day.
I've caught this so much on checks of mine from so many different places that I've worked before where I was supposed to get overtime or like bonus or even sometimes hours weren't counted. And this happens on a regular basis in our society to the tunes of probably, I don't know, he'll probably tell us the number, but it's probably billions and billions of dollars.
Were misclassified as an independent contractor, were refused benefits as an employee, or just straight up didn't get your check. There are at least a dozen different ways your boss can steal the money that you're entitled to so that he can eat it. I mean, I assume that's what they do with it, right? They eat it. They're obviously not spending it, so they must be doing something. Anyway.
They're hoarding it like fucking Scrooge McDuck, man. That's what they do. They fucking have vaults full of coins and cash and they just swim in that shit. I'm serious, like that's a little bit okay, that's a little bit hyperbolic, but they do like hoard it. That's what they do.
The sad reality is that this happens to millions of American workers every year. While the individual amounts are pretty small if you take them week by week, added up, they get into the billions of dollars. At the low end,
I was right.
That only include minimum wage violations total around $15 billion.
Billions and billions of dollars, see?
A year stolen from American workers.
Watch your checks, guys.
$15 billion.
Make sure you're not getting robbed by your employers.
$2 billion more than the number we get from all those other forms of theft. At the high end, estimates that count several different forms of wage theft more than triple that number. And you end up with a whopping $50 billion price tag per year in America and thousands out of the average worker's hands. That's really bad. Objectively, it's worse than the sum total of all the thefts from the intro. By a lot.
New York,
but it's
Chicago,
only the
Los
tip
Angeles.
of a much bigger iceberg. Like you'd expect, wage theft is mostly impacting low and middle income workers, and there's a reason for that. Unlike higher earners, workers from lower rungs of the economic ladder tend to suffer from two related issues in the world of work: low bargaining power and low wages. Low wages are an issue because when wage theft happens, and we know it does, a lot, the amounts are too small to justify proper legal action.
Yeah, they're like, who gives a fuck about them? So what, they lost $300 on their paycheck? Like, that's nothing. You know, it is when you have to fucking pay your rent and you're living paycheck to paycheck. That, you know, that's a lot of money. Like, you know, if you're supposed to get paid $800 on a check and for overtime and shit like that, and you get $500, I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, and some people make less than that.
Now, these are by no means small amounts for the workers themselves, sometimes making up over 10% of a yearly salary. But they will never be enough to bring to a court and defend against a business owner with substantially more capital to spend brushing it under
Plus, they got lawyers. Yeah, they can afford, like, expensive lawyers and stuff like that, too.
the rug. So while that $50 billion number is extrapolated from just 3 big cities, if we count every instance of wage theft that actually happens, it would be much higher. The truth is that for many workers who lose out to wage theft, it is a massive risk to contest it. When issues of wage theft are brought up, employers usually hold all the cards and can threaten cuts to working hours and pay, layoff.
Yeah, they'll just fire you and then, like, make your life a living hell. I mean, they have all of the power as far as that's concerned. That's why we need more things like unions in this country.
Or for some immigrant workers, who are still covered by wage theft laws, by the way, can threaten to report them to ICE. It's really the mark of a great and fair economic system when your country relies on low-paid immigrant labor to barely function and... Wait, what? Oh, I've actually just been told those lower-wage workers might not even get paid. And oh, wait, there's more? Oh, okay. They say if you don't like it, actually you better shut up because we've got the cops on speed dial. Pleasant bunch, huh? And the bad news continues, because wage theft isn't even disincentivized. For one thing, the number of federal investigators meant to protect workers from these crimes has dropped dramatically, to the point where a single bureaucrat is now meant to protect over 120,000 workers. An impossible feat by any account.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. Oh, and then, I don't know if you guys heard about, I mean, this is kind of related. It's not really a stun lock, but if you guys have heard about the fact that taxes are going to be severely delayed this year because they've gutted the IRS pretty much during the Trump administration and haven't done anything to fix the problems since then. So from what I hear is if you're getting a refund, any of that good stuff, it's going to be delayed possibly quite a bit. So hopefully nobody's counting on that pretty soon. But that's what they do is they take all of the money away from institutions that will benefit the prosperity of the smaller man, basically. So that's a lot of fun. Yeah, I never count on one, like, but you know, I usually get a little bit back here and there, especially with my kid. So you know, that tends to happen. But they're getting rid of the child tax credit, and probably, you know, that's going to be a big hurting on people too. So.
And a clear signal to employers that they don't really have to worry about getting caught. And even when they do get called out, the big businesses most guilty of wage theft crimes aren't really impacted. For companies like Walmart, fines and settlements are just the way business is done, and the rare payout will always be lower than the actual money stolen from employees. At the end of the day, they
don't care because they make more money. Anyway, they make billions and billions of doing the wage theft anyways. It doesn't catch up with it, you know. You still haven't gotten any stimulus? Jesus Christ. Yeah, that's it took me, there was a period of time when there were I think it was the first check. I didn't get the first check at all because they made a mistake on my taxes for 2019 when they were filing them. So yeah. Because the not the preparers, but when they were putting my taxes through, somebody made a clerical error at the IRS, and my stimulus got delayed until the second one came, and then I got both of them at the same time. Thanks for joining us, by the way, Oathkeeper.
There are some policy and regulatory solutions that can mitigate this problem. Unfortunately, it will undeniably continue so long as the underlying cause isn't addressed. As long as the capitalist economic model balances power so dramatically in favor of business owners, employees will continue to be disempowered in their jobs and in our legal system. Here we get to the second point. Wage theft is terrible, but it's just a subset of a much larger problem: corporate and white-collar crime. You know corporate crime when you see it, but unfortunately, it isn't very well defined. Oftentimes because an act committed by a corporation or someone acting as a white-collar worker may be objectionable, but not actually criminalized.
Yeah, exactly. They can get by with so much shit. It's not necessarily illegal for them. It should be, and you would think it is, but when it breaks down to it, there's loopholes and things like that they can get by with.
And part of the reason is that in neoliberal and capitalist governments, political structures will always favor the accumulation of capital above just about anything else. Any law that threatens profitability or makes a country less attractive to international capital is off the table 9 times out of 10. The consequences of such a simple favoritism end up either protecting corporations from the repercussions of their criminal behavior or making sure that what they do isn't technically illegal in the first place. And that's a huge problem. Even though most people are worried about quote-unquote street crime, the scale of corporate crime is much greater and has certainly impacted more of us, both because of how much money is involved and how many...
Yeah, because when they commit a corporate crime, just like trickle out down economics doesn't work. When they commit a crime, it affects like everybody else down below them, down the tree, you know.
Many things constitute corporate crime. Corporate crime is a lot of things, and varies widely in practice. Financial crimes are the most obvious example, with embezzlement and fraud usually being the first things we think of. But this wide umbrella also includes things like weapons sales, the sale of dangerous products to the general public with dishonest advertising practices,
Yeah, like lead-based paint, like it took them a long time to get rid of that, for instance.
mental pollution, price fixing, and the use of unsafe working conditions in manufacturing like in sweatshops, to name just a few. Let's take a concrete example like Bernie Madoff, the guy behind the largest Ponzi scheme in history. In just under 2 decades, Madoff defrauded investors out of billions of dollars. Only a
The guy's got a con man smile, like right off the bat, you can
tiny
tell.
fraction of which has been clawed back and put into the hands of his victims. Even if many of his victims were high-profile investors, for thousands of Americans, the money invested in Madoff's scheme was retirement funds and life savings, money that makes a huge difference in someone's life. And although Madoff was eventually arrested and imprisoned, not only have most victims not gotten their money back, but his arrest is actually an anomaly for crimes of this sort. Most corporate crimes go unpunished, if ever addressed or pursued in the first place.
Or the president, you know, like gives them pardons, which happened a lot during Donald Trump's presidency.
Think back to the 2008 financial crisis. After banks and economies around the world collapsed, pushing thousands of people out of their homes and their jobs, the people who made ludicrous sums of money speculating on risky assets and the backs of average people got away with little more than a slap on the wrist in the worst cases, and generous
That guy was the worst Jenga player I've ever seen in my goddamn life. Oh my god.
bonus payments in the
Was he drunk?
best. The result of state collaboration with private enterprise routinely pushed the financial system to its limit, bringing down support beam after support beam in a series of deregulatory efforts until the whole thing rested on flimsy foundations. Everyone knew this level of speculation with people's savings was risky and downright immoral. But for a few people, new regulatory blind spots offered another avenue for profits, and so it remained solidly legal and heavily exploited for years. When it all predictably came crashing down, even the massive political will to rein in the financial system and bring justice to thousands of victims fell on deaf ears, leading to very few changes and even less prosecution. People lost their homes, their jobs, and sometimes even their lives, while others kept their ill-gotten gains or amassed.
Yeah, I mean, during the mortgage crisis and the housing crisis, like all of that stuff that happened during real estate, like in 2008 was bad because so many people lost their homes and lost their properties and things like that, and banks and CEOs of major corporations, mortgage firms, things like that, made out like bandits and then retired. You know, same thing happened with during the pandemic. Look how many people lost their jobs and lost their livelihood. I did. I lost my home and everything during COVID because I was working primarily as a DJ at that point. And I still am, but I have a second job too now. And yeah, I lost everything, and lots of people did. And then people like Jeff Bezos ended up making billions and billions of dollars during that time. So, yep.
Amassed enormous profits. The paradox is that compared to street crime, corporate crimes are incredibly easy to track. Paper trails are the dominant rule of any flow of money and any company policy. It's all right there. Not always in public, but at least 10 times easier to identify and track than a masked face on a pixelated CCTV. The challenge is the power of corporations. Large companies in particular can bury investigations, resist.
Yeah, they can just use subterfuge with lots of money behind it to stop anybody from seeing how much corruption and criminal activity that they're doing at the expense of your average worker, at the expense of the working class as a whole.
Prosecution with the best lawyers money can buy, and reach into the houses of parliament and the campaign funds of the executive branch to make sure they remain safe in the private sector. Not to mention threatening capital flight and the loss of American jobs if things get really dicey. The reality of regulation in capitalist economies is that, although a small proportion of corporate thefts and frauds might be subject to control, most corporations, for most of the time, are relatively free to engage in criminal practices. What's more, our governments are complicit. Either by not criminalizing or failing to enforce and punish acts of corporate misbehavior, governments are either direct or indirect supporters of these acts, whether it's
because they're bought and paid for. I mean, how are you going to prosecute somebody for doing something wrong to the American people when American people vote in politicians who are bought and paid for by those same corporations who are doing harm to the workers? I mean, it's a ridiculous catch-22. There's no way that, somebody who funded putting these people into office are going to vote against the corporate interests that put them there. The only reason that people voted for them is because they were brainwashed into doing so by all of the money backing their campaigns and all of their false promises.
Because they're too powerless to do otherwise, are threatened with a weakened economy, or are incentivized with economic gains. Under capitalist regimes, the power that corporations and capital owners have will always work to our detriment. We are never really free to decide otherwise. But before I put the final nail in the coffin of capitalism and convince you all to become socialist overnight, let's take a look at one last example of crime under
I don't have any reservations that's going to happen to everybody who watches this video. That was kind of funny. And I don't think he does either. That's why he said it.
Capitalism. As much as capitalism promotes corporate crime, it does the same for street crime. The difference is that the latter gets punished with far greater brutality. Capitalism does this in two ways. It creates poverty and inequality on the front end, and on the back end makes harmful behavior justified so long as you're pursuing your own self-interest. The first point is nothing you haven't heard before. Private ownership over the means of production creates classes with massive gaps between them. The wealthy few own a lot, often more than all the poor put together, and create a system where few, if any, can escape these artificial circumstances through approved channels. While government policies can help to alleviate this, poverty is usually rampant, and only ever made more tolerable to locals in the imperial core by its export to the global south. The second half of that equation is more subtle. Day in and day out, capitalism justifies itself through a set of narratives and easy-to-understand phrases like greed is good or life ain't fair, as if, by their simplicity, they are a window into the unknowable truth.
Why don't you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps? Which is physically impossible. According to the laws of physics, that's an impossibility, right? Like, you can't just do that. You can't... Yeah. It's not something you can do.
Of the universe.
That should be the real meaning of it, is like it's a obfuscation of the truth, because you can't pull your self up by your bootstraps. So it's just saying, sit there and die, you fucking poor bastard.
Capitalism justifies self-interest above anything else, with the imaginary idea that eventually, if we all sit in our corner and do what's best for us, it will eventually make everyone else better off too. Somehow. Just trust me on that one. It'll work. And when people are clawing their way to the top in the world of work, we don't seem to have any problem with this logic. The pressure to succeed, and the threat of poverty that looms behind any moment of underperformance, trumps any consideration for another competitor or a fellow worker. Because hey, we all need to make money somehow. At a fundamental level, crime born out of poverty isn't really any different. Putting personal gain first and hurting people in the process is just as much the logic of robbery as it is that of climbing the corporate ladder.
Exactly. You have to always step on somebody else's back, rob Peter, so that, you can pay Paul kind of thing. Except for, so it's like kind of like that, only you're stepping on Peter's back to have Paul notice you, basically. So then eventually you can climb on Paul's back and get George to notice you, so on and so forth, etc., etc., etc.
It just feels a lot more visceral to us. Add to the mix round-the-clock propaganda about what a successful life is meant to look like, with its white picket fences, a nice car, and the luxury of leisure, and the pain and fear of insufficiency justifies crime as much as it justifies corporate self-interest, especially if one of those isn't available to you. But rather than treat these crimes as a natural product of a capitalist system, political regimes in capitalist countries punish some crimes heavily and let others slide by unnoticed, ignoring entirely the role that the greater social structure has played in their emergence. This video started out talking about wage theft, partly because of how big of an issue it is and how contrary it seems to the way capitalist society is presented, as a fair competition in which hard work is the only way we all move forward. Far from contradicting capitalism, however, wage theft, just as much as any other form of crime, is an inevitable product of its natural imbalances of power and the narratives it creates to justify itself. They're taking your money, day in and day out, and on a scale that can't even be fully conceptualized.
When it's hard to make ends meet anyway because of the cost of living raising, which is also kind of a result of some of the same stuff, you know?
It won't be until the fundamental tenet of capitalist society, all power to the owning class, is broken that the average worker will be treated fairly. The solution doesn't lie in regulation, though more of it would certainly help, but rather in destroying the root cause of that power imbalance. Capitalism will always yield extreme inequality, a tiny minority of ultra-rich, ultra-powerful people stealing from the oppressed, subjugated majority. And if...
Now, whereas I believe this to a great extent, I also think that it's going to be a long time before we can get society to see the light on that, you know, to switch over completely to a more democratized economic system. So therefore, I do think that right now we should regulate things and continue to regulate them until things are more even, you know, so that money can't be hoarded in the coffers of the rich like Scrooge McDuck, you know, like, so that they can't do that. So things have to be spread out more so that they don't get rewarded for making huge mistakes, which cost the entire country in major and destructive ways, you know.
That is the only outcome of our current system, then it is time for our current system to go. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that episodes like these are...
Alright. So, yeah. So, I do like most of that video. Like I said, I do consider myself, as far as the end game is concerned, a socialist, but at the same time, I do understand that things take time and that there are ways that you need to kind of roll into those things, right? So I think that improving our social safety nets under capitalism, making sure that there's strong unions, making sure there's more worker co-ops and different types of work environments in our economy is a good thing. Getting money out of politics so that the economy can be more democratized would be a big step as well. So these are all things we need to do. These are all things that we need to tackle and accomplish. We do need to decommodify certain things too, like healthcare, for instance. I think that should be decommodified. Schooling, like even higher education, should be decommodified. Just like the police stations and fire stations are. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at on those things. Like I said, I'll probably never see the end game that I want in my lifetime, but I think that there are ways that we can reduce harm in a major way in our society, and that we could offer solutions so that there's a more equal footing for all people involved. We need to erase a lot of the historical poverty that's going on in this country too, with marginalized people like the black communities and things like that, and just people who have been historically poor. I just think that there are ways to make sure that they have equal opportunity, because money in this country is freedom, and I believe in freedom for all. And if we're giving all of the money to, or all the money's going to one group of people, while there's a whole section of our population who are suffering because they can't make ends meet, it's a big problem, and it takes away the freedoms of half of the people. Over probably about 60 to 70% of the people in this country, you have less freedom than those above you. That's not a democracy. That's not a society where there's equal freedoms for all. It's just not the case. So those are things we need to change for sure.